Okay, welcome everybody to the first Writing Culture Seminar of 2023. Very nice to see you all here, and we're very pleased that we have Crystal presenting for us today. Crystal Sam is a postgraduate researcher in the Department of Humanities. Her research is based on post-9/11 Muslim women's writing, and she's particularly interested in the role of memory and storytelling, looking at how personal memories often intervene and/or contradict official records of history. Her session today is entitled Places, Metaphors and Memories. And without further ado, I will pass over to Crystal.
Hi everyone, hope you can hear me. So I'm doing this paper based on one text by Moja Kaf. It's called The Girl in the Tangerine Scarf. Before going to my paper, I will just summarize the plot. So it's a coming-of-age novel about this Syrian immigrant named Khadra Shami, and it's set in the 70s and 80s in central Indiana. So she is a child growing up between this highly devout and traditional upbringing of her parents and a xenophobic society around her. And as she goes to university, she begins to negotiate her identity and understands that that Islam is more than what her parents had taught her. And then after a point, she marries a person from Kuwait, but her marriage goes sour, and to escape all the drama, she moves or she visits her great aunt, whom she calls Teta, in Syria. And she returns to the United States with a sense of clarity, what she wants to do in the future and how she carries herself as a Muslim and an American. So she moves to Philadelphia after coming to United States, and she becomes a photographer. And the novel actually begins at a point when Khadra is returning from Philadelphia to central Indiana. So I'll go to my paper now. Right. As a subject of inquiry among geographers, historians, and literary theorists, place has a variety of discordant yet non-exhaustive definitions which are constantly challenged and redefined. Human geographers, including Yifu Tuan and Edward Ralph, insist that place is never merely an object or a specific location. Tuan, in his monograph, Space and Place, asserts that places are centers of felt value as a locus of emotional attachment and significance. Dalia Khandioti identifies the discourse of place as a generative source of culture, and significantly, the role of place in the experience of displacement and immigrant identity. Set in the 1970s and 80s, Moja Kaf's The Girl in the Tangerine Scarf charts the spiritual and social landscape of Muslims in Indiana in a way that emphasizes a shifting understanding of place with a particular focus on migration. Throughout her life, the protagonist Khadra Shami encounters various geographies ranging from the flatlands of Indiana to the rich and varied landscapes of Syria. In the novel, Kaf complicates the stereotypical portrayal of suburbia and seemingly homogeneous suburban homes through a vivid description of domestic interiors. The Girl in the Tangerine Scarf further complicates the idea of home in the migrant imaginary through its Syrian American protagonist. By considering these complications, this paper seeks to highlight the role of both material and metaphorical spaces in Kaf's novel and examine how they inform and affect the private and public lives of the characters, as well as the memories the characters associate with those spaces. Like many diasporic writings, The Girl in the Tangerine Scarf begins with a description of the immediate environment as the protagonist drives through the unbearable flatness of central Indiana, instantly establishing the narrative's thematic concern with place. By narrating her story through a protagonist who feels somewhat unwelcome in her own hometown, Kaf explores a religious diasporic hybrid identity in the United States, which is often overlooked, misrepresented, or negated in the Western representations of the diaspora. Khadra's description of the Indiana landscape reinforces this sense of diasporic alienation. I hope you can read the slide. It says, there are silver silos and pole barns, tufts of gold thread on the meridian, and the blue day beginning to pour into the dark sky. But it is not mine, she thinks, this blue and gold Indiana morning. None of it is for me. Between the flat land and the broad sky, she feels ground down to the grain, erased. This juxtaposing narration of what Khadra sees and what she feels is an extension of her sense of trepidation as she returns to Indiana, a land so wide and flat that it makes her lonely. For Khadra, Indiana is a repository of unpleasant memories. It is a place that she grew up in, but ultimately leaves not wanting to return. The flatness that Khadra feels is exemplified by her personal memories of feeling unwanted and alienated. Khadra returning to this Khadra returning to this ground that didn't love her, tries to stave the panic in her gut that is entirely the fault of the state of Indiana and the lay of its flat land to which she had never asked to be brought. Yet the narrative begins and develops through the memories of Indiana. Kauf emphasizes the complexity of return through the theme of separation reunion between a person and the land, tapping into the genre of return home novels, while she also weaves together a sense of inviolable mutuality between a person and their land. Considering the centrality of place in the making and breaking of identities, as opposed to merely being a physical and social context, is also an important feature of sociology and human geography. It represents the position that, in order to explain human behavior, one must deal with their embeddedness in concrete milieu or context. As Susan Armitage and Elizabeth Jameson note, many place-based narratives in American literature have traditionally dealt with heroic tales, stories of adventure, exploration, and conflict. According to Neil Campbell and Alasdair Keene, such white male and heterosexual versions of history have been culturally dominant and have therefore largely formed and defined American national identity. Supported by works of popular literature and art, which continue to perpetuate such narratives, America is still often glorified as a nation of immigrants and melting pot of cultures, a mythology which suggests that anyone could have better opportunities in American society, despite the national, religious, or ethnic differences, and it is therefore considered a kind of promised land in line with Christian belief. In Christian mythology, the promised land of Canaan is a land of excess and abundance. The biblical story traces the journey of Israelites from Egypt to Israel as a journey from oppression to freedom and opportunity. But if examined closely, the journey to Canaan transpires through many literal and metaphorical deserts, and in the tumultuous 40-year journey, the promised land for many people remains a myth. In a similar sense, the flatness and the vastness of the land, both as a physical characteristic as well as in terms of imaginative scope, became a formative image in American literature that often symbolizes or alludes towards opportunity and success. However, Kauf subverts this symbolism and mythology by emphasizing how this dream is not accessible to many immigrants in America. This is illustrated as Kauf describes the journey of the Shami family from the Rocky Mountains to Indiana, which parallels the westward journey of the pioneers. This link becomes explicit as Kauf writes, quote, he, as in Vashti Shami, Khadra's father, had discovered the Dava Center, and so they loaded up everything they owned on the luggage rack of the station wagon and set off over prairie and dale like pioneers. Unquote. As the novel progresses, we can see how the Shamis' home as well as their workplace physically exist in the margins, as the vast expanse of the flat land only exemplify the emptiness and desolation they feel as an immigrant Muslim family in Indiana. The American writer Michael Marton, a native to the American Midwest, presents an understanding of the idea of flatness in American literature, which we can consider in relation to Kauf's novel. In his essay, The Flatness, Marton repeatedly affirms the geographical flatness of the Midwest, and yet, even as the flatness informs the writing of the Midwest, he also suggests that the flatness of the landscape can serve as a foil, the writing standing out in opposition to the background. He urges to think of the material environment as a living, breathing being. Marton writes, the way I feel about the Midwest is the way my skin feels and the way I feel my own skin, in layers and broad stripes and shades, in plains and in the periphery. In this way, Marton presents the Midwest as an organ of sense and not power, delicate and coarse at the same time, and as a place of sense. As a native of the Midwest, Marton possesses a sense of intimacy with the land. While Marton admits that the Midwest may lack natural beauty or industrial growth, it is this sense of absence that forces its inhabitants to introspectively look within themselves. Even though the lived experiences are completely different, for Marton and Calf alike, the Midwest landscape becomes a place of deeply dissolved meanings, settings, events, and fundamental particulars of everyday practice and life. Theoretically, Khadra is a native of Indiana, but the opening scene shows that she's with a map of states of Heartland. It shows that to navigate the landscape upon her return to Indiana, she needs a kind of sense of direction. As Koza Osman argues, it alludes to her loss in its social space and her inability to position herself within it. Khadra is like someone holding a small lantern and going out to investigate, a little afraid of what she might find. And this trepidation adds to the sense that both literal and metaphorical places exist as a continuous renegotiation rather than something fixed and rigid. Whether as an imaginary entity in one's memories or as a physical reality, an individual sense of place cannot come into being on its own, and it is largely influenced by memories, meanings, and attachments to specific place. Alan Pred, in discussing the distinction between space and place, emphasizes that space and physical features are mobilized and transformed into place through human residence and involvement in the local activities and routines, through familiarity and the accumulation of memories, through the bestowal of meaning by images, ideas, and symbols, and the establishment of individual or communal identity, security, and concern. Or put more succinctly, Marcus Dowell argues that place is what takes place. Fred and Dowell thereby suggest that, as with memories, what takes place in and around a place makes it dynamic and constantly evolving through the actions and routines. Owen Jones and Joan Hart Garth Hansen further identify memory as a fundamentally important to ideas of place and landscape and vice versa. They insist that memory is inherently geographic in two senses. Firstly, as stemming from spaces, places, and times that have existed in the past, and secondly, in terms of the prompting and practice of memories in present spaces. In this sense, Karp uses the flatness of Indiana not just to allude to the dislocation of the diasporic community, but also to indicate the struggles of the provincial communities who have often been deserted by the economic hegemony of urban culture. By telling the story through a protagonist who speaks to and of geography, Karp insists important conversations about nation, belonging, and identity. As Carol Fada Conry observes, Khadra's return to Indiana as an adult becomes an entryway into reassessing the trajectories of belonging to the places and homes to which she has been imaginatively and physically connected throughout her life. As the novel progresses, there is an evident shift in the perception of what the flatlands signifies for Khadra. She starts to collect pictures and prints of Indiana landscapes, and these visual prompts help her to realize that Indiana is much larger and varied than the immediate surroundings that she grew up in. After she visits her parents who move away from central Indiana to South Bend, Khadra pronounces, quote, South Bend was not really that flat, hopeless flatness. The North was comfortingly off-kilter. Foreign-born immigrants, Polish and Hungarian, and even Arab, built the industrial cities of North Indiana. People with parents who had accents. It was okay, unquote. While Khadra blames the flatness of Indiana for her sense of non-belongingness, her parents feel alienated by American culture and not by the land itself. Their sense of displacement is affected by the fact that they are considered bottom of the barrel untouchable. The Shamis, in turn, categorize Americans into very superficial categories such as nice, nasty, and ignorant, and those who lead a shallow, wasteful, and materialistic lives. Young Khadra's sense of non belonging is thus further fueled by her parents' attachment to their own home country, as well as their lack of sense of place or belonging in the United States. As Homi Bhabha writes, this struggle is indicative of the pain and awkwardness of a diasporic individual being continually positioned in space between a range of contradictory places that coexist. These conflicted ties feed into how Khadra superimposes her feeling of displacement onto the flat Indiana landscape, which later transforms into ground for introspection. Distinguishing between authentic and inauthentic sense of place, Edward Ralph argues that an inauthentic sense of place is essentially no sense of place, for it involves no awareness of the deep and symbolic significance of places and no appreciation of their identities. This is reflected in Khadra's character as well as she tries to find her rooting in different countries. All her life, she carries within her what Avda Bra says, a homing desire. She faces an emotional as well as a moral conflict as the Shami family decide to get US citizenship. Khadra is seen crying into a pillow, caught between homesick parents and a land that didn't want her. Not just didn't want her, but actively hated her, spit her out, made her defiant in her difference, yet at the same time made her unfit to live anywhere else. As Khadra travels out of Indiana to Saudi Arabia for a Hajj pilgrimage and later to Syria, she figures out that the lived experiences of those places are much different and how they were in her imagination. However, she also realizes that there is a sense of this place embedded in her as she encounters Syria as an adult. Quote, somehow all the unfamiliarity seemed familiar to Khadra. And then we turn here, and there will be a rise in the road and an arch, her mind said. Or no, she wasn't even thinking it with her mind. Was her feet, her body moving itself? And there it was, the rise in the road, the arch. Unquote. Despite the unconscious connection that she feels with Syria, bodily memory and physical environment become crucial for Khadra's embodied sense of place when she realizes that it was in the American crucible where her character had been forged for good or ill. Upon her return from Syria to homeland America, there is an altered understanding of the place that Khadra had hitherto detested. Her bitter return by the end of the novel turns into a sweet realization that all along she'd been a Hoosier, a hennaed Hoosier, but a Hoosier nonetheless. The novel's contrasts are not just between different physical locales, but between the ideas of us versus them and between place and time. The novel demonstrates an understanding of place with an added layer of temporality in a testament to the idea of place being a multidimensional plane that simultaneously acts as a center of meaning and the external context of our actions. Khadra translates this change in perspective and the relationship with Indiana through her photographs. As she takes the photographs of cheering crowds and racing cars at the Indy race, we see how Khadra's perspective shifts from only identifying the repeated structures in the landscape to acknowledging its energy and dynamism. As a photojournalist, Khadra is able to shed light on the intimate history and everyday living of the local Muslim population as a piece of history that no one in America has acknowledged yet, a history of the Muslims in Indianapolis. Carp traces the evolution of her characters as well as the evolution of place in The Girl in the Tangerine Scarf as she explores how physical and imagined places are tied together into continuous processes in a continuous process of becoming. That places affect us and that we in turn affect. As well as considering the Midwest as a sensory place, Michael Martin also describes its flatness as a kind of canvas. He notes, in the flatness, everywhere is surface. As the Bildungsroman of Kadra Shami progresses, Kaf can also be said to identify this flatness as a surface or canvas where she is able to demonstrate growth of a place as well as its inhabitants. On the one hand, Kaf's Indiana engages with an emblematic demonstration of place identity based on stereotypes and hierarchies. On the other hand, it also represents a site of constant renegotiation and becoming. The Girl in the Tangerine Scarf, in Edward Soja's term, records individual and collective reactions to the ordered workings of power in perceived, conceived, and lived spaces. Unquote. Furthermore, by reimagining a typical Indiana suburb into a kind of Islamistan, Kaf represents a varied history of Muslim people from around the world and conveys their complicated relationship with the United States and the Midwest in particular, moving away from what Bell Hooks has called models of assimilation, imitation, or assuming the roles of rebellious exotic. The Girl in the Tangerine Scarves focus on the individual and personal accounts of memories tied to places not only opens up ways for discussing the attitude of United States toward racially and ethnically different people, but also allows us to consider a diverse and inclusive mode of cultural transmission of memories, which has the capacity to simultaneously transform ideas of self as well as place. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very clear and interesting presentation. So we have some time to open the floor to questions. If anyone would like to ask a question, you can put your mic on and speak or type it into the chat. I wonder, while we're waiting to see if people formulate questions, could you tell us a bit about how this work relates to your PhD project more broadly, where it fits in, or a bit more about the kind of themes that connect with your research?
Yeah, so this is one of the 5 sects that I'm analyzing for my thesis, and this talks this kind of sets the context for the post 9/11 Muslim experience, because it is set in the 70s and 80s, and it already shows how xenophobic the community is towards this particular population, and it is sort of a history that we don't talk about enough, I think. Yeah, so that's where it fits. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Meg, did you?
Yes. Yeah. Hi, Crystal. How are you? That was a very good paper. Thank you for that. I wonder if you might say, well, 2 things. First of all, I really like that quotation from Bell Hooks that you had towards the end. So I wondered if it might be possible to use that earlier on, or maybe even towards the beginning, as a kind of organizing idea, or as one of the organizing ideas for the chapter, because I think it's adding another kind of layer to the ways in which you are, or the lenses through which you are reading this material. So I think if you had it earlier on, you could come back to it a few times, because it was very good. And I was very struck by the idea of the kind of tension between ideas of flatness on the one hand representing not belonging or non-belonging, and also the idea, or at the same time, the idea of blankness, a blank canvas, in some ways, that's very related to what you were talking about earlier, ideas of the West, yeah. Of the American West as the place of, opportunity, but at the same time also as a place of danger. Yeah. So I guess what I'm saying is, if you've thought a bit about ways in which this idea of the American dream, which obviously in an American novel, which is a Bildungsroman, we have to be thinking about where that fits in. If you thought at all about that, about the tension of the idea of the American dream, yeah. The possibilities of that.
Yeah, I think the novel ends in a kind of ends on an optimistic note. Then when she returns to the central Indiana. She sees a board for Islamic hygiene. So there's a hand faucet, the advertisement for hand faucet. So she's realizing that, okay, the place is changing, the values are changing. They are trying to be more inclusive, or, they are unafraid to advertise these sort of things. And there's a sliver of hope towards the end. So it also suggests that, this is possible, that survival is possible at this particular place, at this particular time. It's not like before. So I also discuss the interior landscapes, as in I talk about domestic spaces. That's my next chapter. So this is part of my first chapter, and then I talk about the domestic spaces in the next chapter. So I think it kind of ties together, I think.
Well, it's interesting that it ends on a positive note, because since that time, I mean, Indiana is one of the reddest of red states, with all kinds of, anti-immigrant laws, and, so it's sad that, which is very much post 9/11, a kickback. So it's quite interesting that this is, because of when it's written, that there's a potential that things might get better. And perhaps they did for a while, but perhaps not now. That'd be interesting possibly to reflect on. So thank you very much. It's really interesting.
Thank you, Meg. I'll think about it.
Okay, we have a couple of hands up. Anna, your hand went up first.
Hiya. Hi, Crystal. So I was just wondering, you touched on this a little bit with Meg's question just now, but I was wondering about the ending, because I haven't read this book, but I was wondering whether it is a kind of a sort of a completion, a kind of happy ending, a coming home, or whether there's still a lot of ambivalence and discomfort. And I was wondering about her traveling, her being in different kind of places, whether that actually just complicates the idea of sort of home and for her, or whether it allows her to process that towards some kind of conclusive, settled feeling. Does that make sense? So yeah, is it a sort of a coming to a happy ending, or is it more of a just accepting that she will be ambivalent about this place and possibly all places? Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
Yeah, so I think sorry, I can hear myself.
It's okay, let me turn my...
Right. So when she comes back, I think it's the change of idea of home in what she perceives as home. So it is very different experience when she comes back to it as an adult, because as a child she is a subject of everyday xenophobia. She would be picked at for being different racially, or wearing a headscarf. So it was everyday racism and Islamophobia that she had to face. And then when she returns, she also finds that the Muslim community, they have also changed or progressed slightly, ever so slightly, but it gives her hope that, okay, change is possible from their end as well, because the Muslim community were very protective of themselves and categorized, as I mentioned, Americans as very nasty or nice. They were really like very black and white categories. And I think she is mature enough now to understand that there are, memories and personal experiences for others as well. She considers, I think, many people and their experiences as well, and not just hers. But she probably won't stay in Indiana. She'll probably move to Philadelphia.
It's interesting that you mentioned that her experience as a child, and how when she comes back as an adult, she's seeing the place very differently, because thinking about how children exist in those sort of domestic spaces and their whole world, it's hard for them necessarily, especially very small children, to imagine kind of beyond their world, which in her case sounds like a sort of quite suburban quite restricted world. So to kind of compare that childhood embodiment of the space compared to the adult embodiment is kind of an interesting journey.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, Julian, your hand was up next.
Yes, thank you, and thank you, Crystal, for this paper. I find it really interesting because my work is very much related to that as well, because I'm looking at the notion of home through place as well, and I'm actually giving a paper in 2 weeks in this seminar. So we can keep the conversation going. I was just you touched on it in the last 2 questions already, but I was just going to bring up again what Meg says, and I think Martone says as well, this idea of place as a blank canvas. And I wonder whether you agree that place can be seen as a blank canvas, because that seems to me quite interesting, especially in the American context, where maybe place is seen as a blank canvas because what was there before was essentially raised and ignored. And so if place can't be a blank canvas, then what does that say for renegotiation, for this adopting a communal identity? Are there limits to that? And does that sort of require also the sense of belonging, a giving up of the self, at least in part, to be able to join that communal identity? So I was just wondering about, blank canvas, is that possible? And if not, then how does the self deal with that?
Yeah, I think, thank you for that question. There's lots to think about.
Sorry, it's big.
No, it's all right. It's great. So I think what Martone is trying to say is that blank canvas, as in literally the physical lay of the land, because I've kind of researched Indiana, and what comes up immediately is kind of this expansive fields, and there's a sense of nothingness, but there's obviously growth, but visually it's just flat lands, like in this picture. That's what I have no experience of Indiana, but this is what all the images suggest. So I think what he means by it is the lack of anything is kind of a trigger to look inward, so that you can reflect on something that's something to reflect on. And then I mentioned this in my thesis, but I'm not sure if it's I don't know how to fix it. So in ancient Tamil poetry, there's this literary device that connects all the emotions. It's called Tinei, or landscape. It literally means landscapes. So all the content of the poetry is kind of predetermined by the landscape. So for example, if a scene is set in a mountainous region, it means the lovers are kind of uniting, or it represents romance. And there's a desert region or flatlands like this, it means separation or anxiety and things like that. So there's this give and take. There's emotions that are kind of superimposed on a landscape, and the landscape kind of influence a person's emotions, or as well. I don't know if I answered your question, but these are the examples that I can think of.
No, thank you. You did, and it was a massive question anyway. Could you put that in the chat, please, the Tamil concept, because I don't know how to spell it. And I'd find that really interesting. It reminds me sort of the original, I don't know if you've come across this, the original diagnosis of nostalgia as absence from place or absence from home. I think it was a Swiss physician in the sort of 1600s. So nostalgia is not like a distance from time, but more a distance from place in its original sense, which I found really interesting, and that sort of relates to that, doesn't it?
But this character particularly kind of resists nostalgia for a long time, and she kind of accepts that this is home.
Yeah, really interesting. Thank you for the paper.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nicola. You have your hand up.
Hi, really interesting. I'm swirling around in the concepts and the sort of landscapes of thought that you've created, and I'm doing a project on post-traumatic narrative as a social experience, and really I felt a strong sense of these concepts, and they're very racialized concepts and sort of geographied concepts of belonging, place, identity, loss, home, and that, you know, the shapes of the landscape, the embodied landscape, and also not belonging, and the desire to belong but never being able to belong, and thinking of that broadly as a kind of historical condition of capitalist society, a world in which war and accumulation push people around all over the earth in horrible ways, at the same time blaming them for the unease and dislocation and suffering, poverty, deprivation, and so on. And I'm presenting that in a very abstract way to just get at, you know, there's another dimension to that, which is those that the you know, we're talking about displacement and not belonging as a kind of marginalized experience, as opposed to a non-marginalized experience, which is the central plank of who you are, you belong here, people there should all be like each other, look like each other. If they don't, they're outsiders, which of course is a very, it's a completely mythical idea. So the concept or the myth of actually belonging, owning, dominating, I wonder how far that as well fits with your inquiry, and how far you feel that these affective, feeling-based concepts can be constituted as a sort of alternative history. You know, a her story in a way. It doesn't necessarily have to be from a female character. You know, a dominated story. Yes, there's a few questions which might be a bit rambling, but I really engage with what you say.
Yeah, so I think the aim of my thesis itself is to bring out personal experiences and personal memories and highlight them, as opposed to monumentalized or concretized versions of history. So I'm saying that these personal narratives, however they might be, are important, and they need an audience, and they need to be heard, because they might have a different version or different remembrances as opposed to a recorded version of history. So that's the crux of my research, I think.
I wonder whether they need to be heard. Why do they need to be heard?
Because
I mean, I know you're saying they're different from the dominant.
Yeah.
Therefore, they need to be heard. But
no, they're every text that I'm analyzing, so it has a different reality. It might be of the same event. So I'm dealing with post 9/11, not with this book, but the other books. So every account or every memory of the post 9/11 is different, and it's very interesting to see that how it affects them personally and how it motivates them to say, okay, this is my story and this needs to be heard, or this is valid. there's a sense of validity that, yeah.
What I'm getting at is that those marginalised stories are the story.
Yeah.
They are not different stories or side stories, or they must be the story. So therefore, I would say, yeah, they need to be heard because they are the reality and the story. They're not the alternative story, if that makes sense. Yeah, so I kind of welcome it on a larger historical level.
Yeah. Yeah, I can only agree with you, Nicola.
Fantastic. Thank you. It sounds like from the chat, people are having to start to leave to go to other meetings. So if there's any other quick questions in the chat? Nicola, your hand's still up, but I'm going to assume that's a legacy hand, unless you shout that it isn't. Okay, fantastic. So that was a fantastic paper and a really interesting discussion. Thank you very much, Crystal, for presenting, and thank you everybody for your comments and questions. A really interesting discussion. As Julian said, we have he's presenting for us on the 26th of January, so in just over 2 weeks. So emails will be and links will be going around for that very soon, but put the date in your diary, and hope to see you then. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.